We've come to the point in the Gospel of Mark where the behavior of Jesus' disciples would be comical if it weren't so tragic. These guys just get worse and worse. They're fearful. They're jealous. They're argumentative. They're defensive. They're territorial. They're with Jesus. They don't understand Jesus. And instead of learning from Jesus, they bicker among themselves and criticize people from other groups. And a big part of the problem is that they're consumed with ambition. You pick this up, don't you? Because they're arguing about who in the group is the greatest. How ridiculous is that? When was the last time you sat around with your friends arguing about which of you was the greatest? If it were yesterday, keep that to yourself. We'll talk about that with celebrities or athletes, right? Who's the GOAT? The greatest of all time. But who sits around with their colleagues arguing about which one of them is the greatest? Their lives are consumed with ambition. They see the kingdom not as an opportunity to exalt Jesus, but as an opportunity to exalt themselves. They're a part of the movement, not because they have an opportunity to serve God, but because they think they will have influence, power, comfort, perhaps wealth. And they are becoming caricatures of themselves. They behave ridiculously. They know they're being ridiculous. That's why they won't tell Jesus what they were arguing about. They're embarrassed. Jesus, however, takes the opportunity to peel back the layers of the darkness of their hearts, the rebellion that's there even if they aren't fully aware of it. He takes this opportunity to teach them, to instruct them, to open their eyes to their self-consumed, self-exalting posture. And he does it with his wisdom and infinite patience to teach them a lesson all of us need to learn. That greatness isn't a matter of self-exalting, but of self-giving. That's the difference here. And that's the contrast that governs all of the passage we read together. They want to be great, but they don't know what greatness is really about. They think it's about self-promotion. They think it's this self-aggrandizing, having charge over people and having influence and making decisions and having power and do what I say. Jesus will teach them both through his word and in his deeds that true greatness, kingdom greatness, in the unexpected ways of the kingdom of God requires a posture of self-giving. Self-giving love, self-giving life. That's why he starts here to teach them about his death. Chapter 9, verse 30, this is the second time in the Gospel of Mark that Jesus predicts his suffering, his death, and his resurrection. First time came in chapter 8. Second time comes in chapter 9. You'll find there's a third one in chapter 10. In each time, the disciples don't understand what he's talking about. They're confused. They don't get it. He tells them, the Son of Man, this is verse 31, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise. And he's specifically taken them away to a place where they're alone so that he can teach them these things without the crowds interrupting. He understands that real discipleship takes small groups to connect with in deep ways for formation, for relating to Jesus, for prayer, for building one another up, sometimes for correcting one another in love for Jesus' sake. But that's what's happening here. Jesus is leading the disciples on a path of discipleship, and that requires gathering in a small group context for him to instruct them. And so he goes away. They go away alone so that he can teach them the gospel. The Son of Man is going to be handed over into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise. Jesus understands that the fundamental human problem is an inward curvature of the heart. I want things my way. And Jesus reveals that his saving power is revealed in his self-giving love in order to reproduce that character in people like Peter, James, John, and the others, and in people like us. So you get this beautiful gospel of the one who's infinite in power, in glory, in majesty, who speaks and makes things out of nothing, who creates all that is, the one for whom all things are made, the one to whom all glory is due. That one, the Son of Man, humbles himself, takes a self-sacrificial posture. He doesn't show up with a self-aggrandizing egoism. He shows up to suffer. He shows up to die. And he did it to heal rebels, wayward people, in ways that we don't even know we need healing. His posture of humility, of self-giving love, reveals the gospel that is the power of God for our salvation. The disciples don't understand it and are afraid to ask him about it. They're afraid. Their fear holds them back from experiencing all that he has for them, from experiencing flourishing at his touch. In contrast to Jesus' self-giving love, his self-giving posture, as they're on the way to Capernaum, the disciples are arguing. Jesus asks them what they're arguing about, and they won't tell him, which means they knew they shouldn't have been arguing about it. You know, you're with your kids. What are you arguing about? Nothing. It's that kind of thing. They know they're wrong. He knows, regardless of whether they confess it or not. He knows they're arguing about which one of them is the greatest. He knows that the fundamental posture of their heart is one of self-exaltation, self-promotion. They're driven by their egos, not by the gospel. And so Jesus gathers them and sits them down because whether they're willing to confess their sin, he knows what they need. Even if they're unwilling to confess their sin, he knows what the remedy is. And so he sits them down and he tells them, the question isn't who's the greatest. The question is who will be the servant of all. You want to be greatest in the kingdom? You want to be first. Well, whoever aspires to that will end up in the final spot, the last place. Anyone who wants to be first must take the position of being last, must become a servant to others, a servant. He wants his disciples, who he gathers into a group, a small group, so that he can teach them, and he teaches them that he wants them to serve. This, by the way, is one of the reasons we spend time talking about a discipleship path marked by worshiping Jesus, connecting as he modeled, and then doing what he said, serving. Trusting him that will form the kind of people who do ministry inside the walls, outside the walls, who plant churches, whether it's Birmingham, Kenya, India, or somewhere else. People who make new disciples. People who engage, who serve, who offer something to people who can't offer anything back for the sake of the kingdom and with the gospel on their lips. That's what Jesus is after here. That's the kind of people he's trying to form. But in order to form them, he's got to reveal the things in their lives that don't embody the character he wants to reproduce. And so in the forthcoming passage, the rest of this passage, he highlights three postures, three areas of life where this self-oriented posture is manifest easily. One is ministry, one is marriage, and one is a relationship with children. That's where he starts. Ministry, we saw someone else driving out demons in your name. We told him to stop. Marriage, conflict with Pharisees about divorce and the nature of marriage, and then whether or not they're willing to welcome children. Notice how the part about children is woven through in multiple places. He starts with that. You got to be the servant of all, so take a look at this child. Whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me. Why does he use a child as an image of the way the kingdom advances? Well, think about where they are. They're in Judea, in an occupied situation, Roman soldiers all around, in poverty. If you think about children in impoverished nations, particularly societies that are highly stratified, you got people who are at the top of the ladder and people who are at the low ladder, the low part of the ladder. And typically, if you're at the top, you're there because people need stuff from you. Like you got something to give. You can do the this for that. I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine. And that's how you get up the ladder, isn't it? By making deals and networking. Well, who's at the bottom of the ladder? The person who has nothing to offer you. And who is that in a poor, occupied, impoverished nation? Well, it's the dirty little kids running around barefoot. They got nothing to offer. They can't do anything for you. They need you to scratch their back, but they're not going to scratch yours. Couldn't reach it if they wanted to. They got nothing to give. So Jesus takes the ultimate example of a person who really doesn't have anything to offer upwardly mobile people and says, the kingdom looks like caring and accepting people who have nothing to offer the community. No assets, no resources. They need you. But they don't have any resources to offer. Kingdom is like accepting people like that. So he starts with the children, then he goes into some other things. Next we hear about John, who almost feels like he's bragging. Teacher, we saw someone driving out demons in your name, and we told him to stop. As if Jesus is going to be proud of that. He's not part of our group, and obviously we're the only ones who can do ministry in your name. We're the disciples, the 12. You see this defensiveness, this territorialness. This is our kingdom movement, not theirs. Almost has that kind of similar vibe to when Baptists and Methodists are making jokes about who gets to lunch first or something like that. Who does better ministry? Who's more faithful? We're glad we're not like them. Jesus responds in an unexpected way. You don't tell Jesus what you've been up to if you expect him to tell you to stop. Don't stop him, Jesus said. For no one who does a miracle in my name can in the next moment say anything bad about me. Whoever is not against us is for us. Truly I tell you, anyone who gives you a cup of water in my name, because you belong to the Messiah, will certainly not lose their reward. And Jesus is putting his finger on the fact that they take the ministry as the occasion for their platform, their self-exalting posture. Their hearts are curved in. We're the ones who can do it, not you. And even if you're setting someone free from demonic oppression, we want you to stop. They can't flourish. You can't do it unless you have our permission. This is a symptom of the problem of thinking they are the greatest of all time. Jesus says, you've got to be a servant who takes a posture of self-giving if you want to really understand the nature of my kingdom. We're going to come back to the stuff on hell at the end, so just hold on for that. The disciples are engaged in self-exalting ministry. Jesus has to reframe things for them. Mark then tells us a story about the Pharisees who have come to test him. And they test him by asking a question about divorce. This is one of those passages that is often used as something of a hammer to knock people around or damage people or show them how they're not living into God's purposes. Crucial principle of biblical interpretation is only 3 words. I want you to remember it. Context is everything. Context is what? Context is every passage, every word that Jesus speaks must be read in context. At the end of this section, he's going to say something that indicates everything he says must be read in context. And anytime we take something Jesus said, pull it out of context and throw it on social media or a billboard or whatever, we risk misrepresenting what he said. So context is everything. So let's talk about the context. First of all, this isn't just Jesus standing up preaching a sermon on marriage. It's Jesus who has just run into some people who are trying to trap him into saying something that they can use against him. Verse 2, chapter 10. Some Pharisees come and tested him. They tested him publicly by asking, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Now, to understand what's going on here, you need not only the biblical context, but some cultural context as well. They are asking him to step into an ongoing debate that was alive in the first century about the grounds of divorce. Not just whether divorce was permissible, but what grounds on which a divorce could be permitted. And the whole debate revolved around the interpretation of Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. I'll read a little bit of that for you, and it will help illumine the question. Deuteronomy 24, part of the Torah, the Mosaic law that explains situations where divorce is permitted. Verse 1, if a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds, crucial words here, something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her away from his house. And then he goes on to sort of talk about some of the other circumstances. The debate on which there were 2 schools of thought, the question on which there were 2 schools of thought in the first century, a couple different well-known rabbis, one took one view, the other took a different view, were on those 2 words. It centered on those 2 words, something indecent. One school of thought leaned into the something. If your wife does something, well, something could be lots of things, couldn't it? And that was kind of their posture. Well, if you're unhappy, whatever the something is, write that certificate and be done with her. Something could be anything as simple as burning the peas, or not sweeping the floor the right way, or finding another woman that you preferred. You can come up with all sorts of things that cover something. The other school of thought leaned into that word, the second one, do you remember what it was? Indecent. And said, no, you can't divorce for any old something. It's got to be a moral flaw, like a major moral thing. And so they leaned into that word indecent to say that Moses didn't mean any old something. He meant something particularly morally flagrant or problematic. So you can see how the debate went. You had one group that kind of wanted to be able to get out for any old reason, any old something. And then the other group was saying, no, not any old something, something that's particularly morally, flagrantly wrong, like infidelity or something like that. So that's the debate. Two different schools of rabbinic thought, two different rabbis, well-known guys. If you want to know what their names are, catch me later, I'll tell you. And that's the debate. And so the Pharisees asked Jesus the question because they want one of those two schools to be mad at him, and they don't really care which one it is. They ask him a question about an existing debate to test him, to trap him, to undermine his public validity, because they knew, well, if there's only two sides and you answer it one way, you're going to upset somebody, right? If there's a debate and there's only two sides, well, he's got to pick one. We want him to pick one, and we don't really care which one he picks as long as the other side thinks he's discredited. That's the test. That's the trial. That's what they're trying to get. What they haven't figured out yet, and they should have, because this isn't the first time they've run into Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, is that Jesus never answers the question the way they think he's going to. He always answers the question in a way that reveals the darkness of their hearts. You think they'd learn, but they haven't learned. And so Jesus comes along and asks them a question. They've asked him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? They want him to take an opinion on Deuteronomy 24 that will upset someone. Instead of doing that, he responds by saying, what did Moses command exactly? What did Moses command exactly? They said, well, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away. And here Jesus makes the point. He asks a question that reveals that their assumptions are the problem. Their assumption is, how much can I get away with and not get in trouble with God? How much can I do without breaking the letter of the law? Forget the spirit. The spirit is treat the other person respectfully, isn't it? They want to know, how bad can I treat somebody without sinning? How much can I get away with without violating the commandment? That's a question that reflects what sort of posture? Not a posture of self-giving, but a posture of what? Self-exalting. What can I get away with? It doesn't matter what expense there is. It doesn't matter who gets hurt. It doesn't matter who gets thrown away, as long as I can't be blamed. So I'll go as far as I can. I will toe the line without breaking the letter of the law. So Jesus puts all that in perspective. Yeah, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce, but it's because you're a sinner. It's because you have hard hearts. And then he puts the whole thing in perspective. He says, from the start, God created male and female, united them together. For this reason, man will leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife. The two will become one flesh. Note that here Jesus could have redefined marriage. He chose to restate and quote Genesis. The two are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. That's the ideal. That's Genesis 1 and 2. Sin shows up in chapter 3, and we don't have the ideal situation anymore. Instead, we have rebels. We have hard-hearted people. Jesus goes on to say, Moses wrote the commandment. God gives the commandment through Moses because of your hard-heartedness, because when you have hard-hearted people, vulnerable people get hurt. When you have the reality of sin in your life, vulnerable people get damaged. They get thrown away, they get discarded, they get disposed of. So Jesus is saying God designed one man, one woman in a covenant forever. And what God joins, don't rip it up. However, given the fact that you're all a bunch of self-oriented sinners, God, through Moses, made some concessions, some stipulations to protect the women you're married to from your sin. Because in the ancient world, who were the more vulnerable people? The wives. In the first century Judea, the women didn't have a lot of rights, almost none. And the man could pretty much write that certificate and be done with her like yesterday's newspaper. But all through Scripture, we find God creates processes and commandments to protect people like that who are vulnerable in society. And so, yes, Scripture permits divorce, recognizing that it's not God's ideal, but that because people are sinners, it also isn't always, continuing isn't always best. Yes, Jesus says the separation is permitted, but it's got to be done in a way that gives her dignity and protection. Why? Well, because you guys are sinners. That's why. Because you're more concerned with exalting yourselves and getting whatever you want, using other human beings made in God's image for your pleasure, and then dispensing of them when you're done. Jesus wants to make the point that human beings made in the image of God are not disposable. Can't just throw them away when you're done or when you find another that you prefer. Human beings made in the image of God are not disposable. And it requires a posture of self-giving to make that relationship work the way God wants it to. So he rebukes them. And he calls on them. Calls them out. He doesn't take a position on the debate. He points to God's ideal and highlights one relationship particularly, one covenant, a marriage covenant, that requires more selflessness than any other. Because that embodies the character of the one who was handed over, who suffered, who looked not to his interests but the interest of others. The selflessness that is required to make a marriage work embodies the character of Jesus, who looked not to his interests but to the interest of others. I like to have fun with this when I'm doing premarital discipleship. They have no idea what's coming. We'll have a session where we spend some time talking about other-oriented love and how that's Jesus' posture towards us, and he wants to reproduce that in your relationship for the church to see, for your friends to see, for your children in the future to see the gospel through that relationship. Self-giving, self-sacrificing, other-oriented love. Years are going to pass by, just a few. You'll probably both be working, and you'll find you're going to have a baby. You'll be excited. It's going to be great. Then the baby will come. You'll have a good time. You'll love on the baby. And it won't be long before the baby wakes you up at 2 o'clock in the morning. You'll pretend you're asleep and not woken up because you'll want the other one to get up. After all, you did the dishes and it's their turn. You've all been working. You're all tired. You don't want to get up. Self-giving posture, a posture of self-giving love, is a posture that gets up when you don't want to. And they look at me, yeah, we're great with that, Pastor, we're great with that. But I know, you have no idea. It's coming. You will be in situations that are subtly revealing that you'd rather be served than serve. And they will show up in the slightest ways. And this is the crucial piece, right? Because none of us are arguing about who's the greatest, But all of us find ourselves in relationships where we'd rather be served than serve, right? That's pretty common. And Jesus is inviting all of his followers, whether it's first century or 21st century, in those moments, those subtle, unexpected moments when you're awakened in the middle of the night and you need to embody self-giving love, and you don't want to because you're tired, and it's hard to be selfless when your head is on a pillow. That's the moment Jesus says, can we be done with self-exalting and embody self-giving? Because that's what the gospel calls us to. He's not quite done. If he'd stopped there, we'd probably been a lot happier with what he had to say. The disciples go into the house and ask Jesus more about this. And this is the crucial word that indicates context is what? Context is everything. When they went in the house, the disciples asked Jesus about this. Well, if you're an English teacher, you know when you get a word like this, it's referring back to something. What's it referring back to? Well, that whole conflict with the Pharisees, the whole question, and all that Jesus taught about God's ideal for marriage, God's concessions to protect the vulnerable, the disciples ask about that. Tell us more about this. We don't understand. We thought the two rabbis who were arguing about it, one of them had to be right even if we didn't know which one, and now you've gone and taught differently. Help us understand. And Jesus says this, we wish he hadn't. Anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. That sounds harsh. And if she divorces her husband and marries another man, she commits adultery. But remember, context is everything. Is Jesus talking about every remarriage that could ever possibly happen for any possible reason? He's not. He's talking about divorces and subsequent marriages that reflect the sort of thing he's been talking about. Anyone who divorces his wife because he sees her as disposable. That's what we were talking about, remember? Anyone who divorces his wife for any old reason, just because he's tired of the whole thing. That one, context is everything, that one commits adultery against her. He's not saying that remarriage is forever barred for his followers. He's saying that if you see your wife or husband as someone you use and then you're done with, there's a serious problem that needs to be dealt with and healed. And God won't honor that posture going forward into a new covenant relationship. Context is everything. This verse has been taken to beat up divorcees in American evangelicalism so many times. Pull it out, slap it on social media. A verse without a context will do a lot of work for you, won't it? And when we take it in context, Jesus is calling upon his followers to embody not a what can I get out of this relationship, but what can I give? And that's something the world needs to see a lot more of right now, isn't it? Because we are racked with marriages all around us that end for less than good reasons. It's difficult, it's painful. I've been in pastoral settings. Some of you have probably experienced this, where two people in a marriage and remaining there in no way represents God's best for their future. It's not because it's good or right. It's because hearts are hard and there's a lot of pain and hurt. The church should be present to care and minister for hurting people, not hammering them with verses taken out of context. Jesus wants Pharisees, disciples, and us to make that shift through his grace and by the power of his Spirit from the what can I get out of it and how far can I go to what can I offer and how can my life embody his love towards you. That's what these texts are about. It's what Jesus wants to see. So he comes back around to children. The disciples are being territorial again. Yeah, it's great if the politicians take a photo op with a baby, but don't let them all in. The disciples rebuke the people who are bringing their children to Jesus, but Jesus rebukes the disciples. Let them come. To restate the point, his kingdom has doors open to those who aren't contributors, who don't have anything to put in the basket, who need far more than they can give. And a posture of welcoming vulnerable, weak, resourceless folks embodies the character of Jesus and the kingdom that he came to bring. That's why he loops the thing with the children in here, and that's why he offers such a serious warning in chapter 9 about causing the little ones to stumble. He calls upon his disciples to be servants. He says you should be the kind of people who are offering service and a cup of water in my name. Anyone who does that won't lose their reward. You should not be the kind of people that hinder the helpless from coming to me. And if you are that kind of person, it'd be better for somebody to tie a big rock around your neck and throw you into the ocean. This is a place where he's using hyperbole. The church has never commended people lopping off limbs for their sanctification. Jesus is saying over-the-top things to make a very specific point. That your sanctification is important enough that the reorientation of your life from self-exalting to self-giving, that reorientation is important enough that you must take drastic measures to be surrendered to the work of the Spirit that he wants to do in your life. It's better to enter heaven with one hand than hell with two, Jesus says. It's helpful to understand what he means when he talks about hell here. Some of your translations may have a footnote, or you may even have the original word there. The original word Jesus said is Gehenna. You may have heard that. Gehenna was a place outside the city. Centuries before, a couple of the bad kings, one of the bad kings had committed child sacrifice on that piece of land to pagan gods. Well, in the Hebrew mind, when you sin that bad on a piece of land, the land is forever stained. It's cursed. Can't live there. Probably don't even want to walk there to get somewhere. Don't shortcut through Gehenna. It's cursed. What are we going to do with it then? Well, I know. Let's put our trash there. And that piece of land where the kings committed grievous sin became the city dump outside Jerusalem. So imagine cursed land with all the garbage piling up. And you can't let it pile up too much, so what do? You set it on fire to burn it down. Imagine the stench, the disgust, the sight, the cursed history. Jesus says if you want an image for eternal loss, that's what it looks like. If you want an image for eternal loss, it looks like the plot of land outside the city where we burn the trash because some kings committed child sacrifice to pagan gods centuries ago. That's a pretty robust image, isn't it? How seriously does Jesus take the necessity of reorienting the heart? Serious enough to warn his disciples about the possibility of eternal loss. That's serious. Instead, he says, what I want you to do is be salty. Now, he doesn't mean what we typically mean when we call someone salty. Verse 49, everyone will be salted with fire. He uses it in 3 different ways. Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can you make it salty again? Have salt among yourselves and be at peace with each other. What in the world is going on there with the metaphors? Salt and fire are both purifying elements. Jesus recognizes that the disciples are facing a trying time where they will be tempted to exalt themselves. Instead, they must be purified. They must be sanctified. They must become self-giving people instead of self-exalting people. You'll be salted with fire. You need to persevere. Salt is good. If it loses its saltiness, its distinctive flavor, can't put that back. So you disciples, if you embody self-exalting, then you're not distinctive, are you? You need the Spirit of God to turn you into self-giving people, to embody the character of Jesus, the character of God revealed in Jesus. And when that happens, well, you'll be salty. Your life will be distinctive. You will look different than the people around you. And he says, have salt among yourselves. This is more of a table image. Pass the salt. We're here to spend some time together. You can see the parallelism. Have salt among yourselves, be at peace with each other. That's a sense of fellowship. So here's the thing, guys, all rolled into one. You've been divided, you've been argumentative because your hearts are consumed with your own greatness. You need to be refined. You need to be distinctive. You need to maintain your fellowship. That's what he wants them to do. It's what he wants us to do. And he invites his followers to embody practices that reinforce the posture. Remember that bit about the cup of water in my name? I'm going to gather you, and I'm going to send you to serve. If you're doing that, if you're practicing serving in the church, outside the church, at the local mission, in another country, if you're practicing that for the long haul, it's going to have an effect on your heart. The Holy Spirit will use that to take that self-exalting inward curvature. What can I get out of this to turn it out? And the first time you offer that cup of water, the first time you share the gospel, the first time you engage in that ministry, you might think, oh, that was hard. I don't know if I can keep doing this. But over time, as you're formed, you'll find you're saying something like, how can I not do this? How can I not go? How can I not serve? How can I not minister? How can I not tell my neighbor about Jesus? When that happens, you'll find that what Jesus calls for is becoming the reality of your life. That the fundamental posture of your heart is shifting from self-exalting to self-giving. That, Jesus says, is the unexpected nature of the kingdom and the reality of true greatness. The truly great people in the kingdom of God are the ones who trust Jesus enough to cultivate a life of looking to the needs of others. Will you pray with me?